Hey, everybody, this is It's Gonna Be Okay with Dr. Roseanne, and I have an unbelievable guest, an unbelievable, inspiring episode that I just can't wait to share with you. So, as a mom of neurodivergence, what is our fear? We're afraid that they're going to be living in the basement, that nothing's going to happen, that every obstacle is something they can't overcome. And that's what today's episode is all about, is dispelling all those myths. So, we're going to talk about parenting neurodivergent kids, helping your child, your teenager, just be a successful adult. So, we're going to talk to Zhara Astra. She's a filmmaker, she's a professor, she's also a speaker, educating people all about neurodivergence. And we're going to talk about your journey today from childhood to today and really all the things that were helpers or hurters and things that other parents need to know about. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. So talk to me about your journey of understanding that you have autism and what it was like for you when you look back as a kid, when you put the pieces together. How did you figure this out for yourself? Because you didn't figure this out until adulthood.
Exactly. I would say I was always a bit of an outsider and kind of quirky and in my own world. So I have two sons, and when my son was about 4 years old, I started to realize that he was different and in a lot of ways like me, though. And I ended up getting him a diagnosis for autism. And through the process, I saw that there were a lot of similarities between some of his mannerisms and quirks and difficulties and some that I had as a child. He got the oppositional defiant disorder diagnosis as well. And I said, hey, that's me. That's me too. So I really started to deep dive into myself at this time. And I realized that I was probably autistic. And it was actually Scott, my co-producer on the documentaries, who first suggested that he thought maybe I was on the spectrum. And I remember being shocked. And I said, how dare you? I'm not autistic. What are you talking about? Because I have a little cousin that I helped raise when I was younger and take care of. And he's a non-speaking autistic boy. And that is what I thought autism was. That's what a lot of us think that it is, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I started to just look into the stories of other women who are discovering that they're autistic. I got a brain scan done. And then I said that, well, that's not enough. I need more. And then I got a diagnosis. And it's interesting through this process because a lot of us experience a bit of imposter syndrome, where we get the diagnosis, we get the brain scan, it's all out in front of us. And because we're adults still figuring this out about ourselves, we have these moments of doubt where, well, wait a minute, I'm not autistic. And it's just been a really fascinating journey
Besides the oppositional defiant, right, the ODD component, which I always feel like, to be honest, well, there's no brain pattern, just so you know, Zhara, for that. But it's always a symptom of something else,
I
right?
agree. Yes.
Right. And so you're a tough cookie. You're also super smart. And there's a lot of wonderful features. What are some of the things that you saw in your son besides that, a tendency to say no? What are some of the things that you saw in yourself as a child when you look back?
I'd say that my son was very angry, and I was also very, very angry as a child. And I see now that that comes from being misunderstood.
So, Zara, when you look back and as a child, what were some of the symptoms that you saw in yourself that you put together and realized, wait, maybe I am autistic? Besides the oppositional behaviors, were you seeing sensory sensitivities? Were there social difficulties? What were some of those symptoms that, wait, maybe weren't as extreme as your cousin, but are somewhere in that autistic spectrum?
I was and still am extremely hypersensitive to so many things. The way that I approached food, the smells, sounds, textures. I didn't wear shoes really until I went to college. I didn't wear shoes. I didn't like how they felt. I didn't like my toes felt suffocated, right? So there was a lot of texture things and lights and sounds and people. And I would get very like sensitive and emotional about things. And then I was also very, very angry, like my son. And, I think a lot of that had to do with being misunderstood. Just the way that I approached life and the way that I viewed things. And a lot of little girls, they were interested in dolls and as we started to get older, boy bands. And that didn't make sense to me. Because for me, there has to be functionality with everything that I do and everything that I learn and everything that I read.
I want to talk about this because you have a lot of sensory sensitivities, as you just discussed. And I'd love to know if anybody ever talked to you about shoes, Zhara. I mean, you didn't wear shoes until college. Was they like, oh, it's just Zhara? You were probably a successful student.
I was an A+ student, an honor student. And it's interesting because I have very hippie parents and they let me just be my own unique self. And so, yeah, I didn't wear shoes and I dressed weird and I just did what made sense to me and what was comfortable. I wasn't like a let me wear dresses kind of girl because that wasn't practical. How can you climb trees? That doesn't make sense to me, right? So my parents very much just gave me this landscape to be myself and kind of explore who I am in the world.
Which can I say is amazing?
I'm so grateful to them for that because they never made
Yeah.
me feel bad about being different. They just
Yeah.
said,
And
"You
you
be
didn't
you."
did you know you were different when you were growing up? Did you think I'm a little different? Like, did you have a tribe?
I always felt like an alien on this planet. I
Mm.
thought I was an actual alien. I don't belong here. I'm not like these people. I'm not like these girls. They have interests in, dolls and boys and boy bands. And I'm interested in philosophy and the brain and in the meaning of life, which was not, as common in Texas as a little girl. So I always knew
Probably
that I was
not,
different.
Zhara.
Yeah. Yeah. So I always knew I'm different, but I didn't know why. So with that, there's growing up feeling like there's something wrong with me. And I would sit in my bed at night and I would try to figure it out. And I'm doing these psychoanalysis on myself at 7, 8 years old. And I'm like, okay, am I crazy? Maybe I'm a crazy person. Well, that doesn't add up. Well, maybe I'm this, just trying to figure out who I am and where I fit into this world.
And were you like your parents were obviously very loving and open and supportive. Were you vocalizing to them like, "Mom, I'm this," or these questions and these thoughts and feelings? Were you able to talk about it with your mom or dad?
I feel like I just internalized a lot of this and I kept it to myself because I felt misunderstood and I was also the difficult child. So, I grew up in a loving way though, being told like, "Oh, well you're difficult, you're just dramatic, you're just
You're
sensitive."
sensitive.
Mhm. So I'm slapped with all of these labels, which they may have been saying as a joke, but after hearing for a lifetime how dramatic and difficult and sensitive you are, it starts to get to you at a point.
Of course. Yeah.
Mhm.
And when you were, so you're in these high level classes, you're
Mhm.
successful, you're very hyper focused, right? Which you now know is an autism and
Mhm.
ADHD superpower, can be a superpower or an Achilles heel, depending on where your hyper
Mhm.
focus is, right? Um, were you able to find your tribe along the way? Did you have a buddy or two? Like, what was it like for you socially?
Mm. So I have something that I call the Christina theory, where every Christina is my best friend since we were 4 years old. She's like my little sidekick. And the Christina theory is essentially that every autistic girl, you need a Christina. You need someone that is your ride or die. They're by your side. They let you be yourself. And even when you are difficult or when you're bossy, because I was extremely bossy, because you have to remember, like, there's a right way to play in our mind, there's a right way to do things. So you need a Christina who's going to kind of go along with that and let you be the leader. And so thank God for her.
Thank
Um,
God. I love you, Christina.
love Christina.
Oh,
And she
everybody needs a Christina. Forget
everybody
about
needs a
if you're
Christina.
neurodivergent. We all need a ride or die friend.
That's
I'm
right.
Italian. I mean, that's just what you do,
That's right,
you
and to this
know?
day, I'm gonna see her later on today. She's my best friend, and
Oh,
she
that's
has
like,
stuck by my side through all of the stages, that I've gone through. And so
yeah.
although it was easy for me to get along because I feel like part of being an autistic woman is that we're really good at masking, and not that I did it intentionally, but I can be a chameleon and I can blend in with any group. I can get along with one of my superpowers. I can get along with anyone on the planet. I can have a meaningful conversation with anybody on the planet. And I've been like
You
that
really
since I was a
can.
little girl.
You know a lot about a lot of different things, and you are really masterful having watched you
Mhm.
in meeting people where they're at.
Yeah, well, that's the ADHD part, right? Is that I know a whole lot about a lot of things.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And you're excited and interested in it. And for all those people, and I don't know what your son's experience is, but for a lot of autistics and neurodivergence in general, finding your Christina is not always the road and the path, right? So was your son able to find his Christina, his Jacob or whoever it is?
mhm. My son did find his best friend in that his special interest is horror movies, and horror characters. And so he knows everything about, all of these horror movies and characters. And he found his little buddy when they were in first grade who also has that special interest. And so
What a unique special interest.
yeah, it's hard to find, and it's also been challenging in school because other kids come up and they read their stories that they write, and then my son reads a story about a killer doll, and
Yeah.
not everyone
Yeah.
is into
He
that.
can come over and hang out because I love the serial killer shows, you know what I mean? My kids are like, "Please don't make me watch another
Yeah,
serial killer show," and I'm like, "But
yeah.
it's so
But
informative," you
but
know?
having a friend is so important for everybody, but for autistic people especially because we do feel so alone.
Yeah.
We're because we spend so much time in our head, right?
When you look back and you realize you had that anger, right? Like, does it make sense to you now that some of the sensory processing parts were
Mm.
there? You have such a strong sense of justice, it's right or it's wrong. All these factors really play into that, right? And I think anger is a concern that a lot of parents come to me and often seek me out just because of that,
Mhm.
right? That irritability, that in there. What do you feel like along in this journey that was helpful for you or could be helpful for parents in helping to support that anger? Because nobody likes to feel angry.
Well, I wanna say first, I feel like a lot of the anger comes from feeling so much at one time and not understanding it. So when my son, he gets so angry, and when I ask him why, he's like, "I don't know. We don't know why we feel angry. We don't know why we have all of these emotions and sensations, and why this fabric is sticky, and why the smell of that guy's cologne is setting me up." We don't really understand all those things, especially as a child. So for my son, I try to talk to him about things, and when he gets angry, I develop this system with him. Called the checks or X, right? Where he gets so angry that he can't vocalize what he's experiencing. So in those moments, I go, okay, are you angry? Check or X, and he'll use his fingers, right? And I'll start asking questions and trying to like dwindle down what it's about. And then after a few minutes of that, he's forgotten that he's so angry he can't talk, and now we're communicating.
I love that so much. I can't even tell you. Because one, it's tapping into a visual kinesthetic,
Mhm.
right? That is so highly developed for most neurodivergents, right? It's taking away it can just that part, if you can access that, it can
Mhm.
take away the verbal, but it's also getting you to verbalize so that you can connect to those uncomfortable sensations.
Yes.
And that is critical because
Mhm.
if everything feels the same, how can you distinguish? And that's why there's often one emotion that comes up. So we
Yeah.
need to create an awareness of the variety of
Mhm.
emotions so they know what to do and use those strategies,
Yeah.
right? And it's a distractor, like you said, which
Yeah.
I love
And
distraction.
and then we also, I also do this thing with him where I say, "Okay, in this moment, what do you need from me?" And I just say, point to a finger. Do you want me to listen? Do you want me to give you advice? Do you want me to hold you, or do you want me to leave? And 10 out of 10 times, he points to number 3. He wants to be held, but he can't say it. He can't vocalize that because he's so stubborn, and he's, that's the oppositional defiant. He can't say it, but it's just like he's going to look away. He's going to avoid eye contact, and he's going to like begrudgingly point to 3. And so I just grab him and I hold him in that moment, and then we laugh, and then
so many parents, when kids get angry or they have these behaviors that are, hard, they're hard for the parent, they're hard for the kid. They often want to know, like, what should I do to discipline it? I'm like, no, you just did the right thing, right? And hugging, right? We're not, if a kid was angry and yelled at his brother or punched a hole in the wall, they don't want to do that. They don't want to act like that. And really what we should do is give them more compassion. And on top of it, give them strategies. And you did all of those things, which is amazing.
I'm just figuring it out as I go along because
Well,
we don't know what we're doing here, right?
Yeah. Well, and so many parents are neurodivergent themselves, right? And so I see 2 paths in the neurodivergent parent. The parent that's like, I'm going to use what I learned to help my neurodivergent kid, or I'm going to pretend that I'm in denial and it's not affecting them. And we clearly know denial is not useful.
Yeah, but with being a neurodivergent parent, it's interesting because I always say I have to schedule my meltdowns around my kids' schedule, right? So I'm going to drop them off at 8. I can't have my own kind of sensory meltdown until they're gone. And sometimes though, the two cross over. And so part of being a neurodivergent parent is I apologize a lot. And I come to my kids and I say, look, I get overwhelmed by loud noises and things like this sometimes. And when you guys are yelling, then sometimes it makes me heightened in my voice. And we know that doesn't help to dissolve any kind of problems.
And
that just doesn't help.
It doesn't help, right? And that being self-regulated most of the time is the best way to help your kid self-regulated. But I also love that you're talking about apologies. I just talked all about this last month. I did this whole thing about self-regulation. We had self-regulation January. We're filming in February. And apologies feel hard for people, right? But there's so much for kids, right? It's teaching them to show the behavior we want from them, but it's also letting them know that it's okay to make mistakes, right? But you still have to think about how the other person feels, and it creates a lot of empathy, which can be harder for a neurodivergent when you're in survival mode and you're uncomfortable. And, you're not going to just demand it happening. You have to model the behavior.
Absolutely. And I think that with the whole like justice aspect of being autistic, because that's one of the things that really would set me off as a child and still does, is injustice. Why am I getting in trouble for something that I've seen my mom do? So with that, I really have to own my own flaws and my own mistakes and just kind of set it out there for the kids and say, hey, I messed up. Sometimes we mess up.
Totally. I mean, I mess up all the time. I talk about that I had this epic meltdown in the middle of BJ's, and that videotape's going to surface one day. With both my kids, and the people just passing me as I'm having my meltdown. When we, really talk about, our kids and struggling and the fear and moving into high school and college, and, you talked about a strong sense of justice and a lot of strong features, which I know are serving you well today, right? Because you've learned to cultivate them, right? And you're really good at adapting. What was the college experience like for you because my guess is you probably were astounded by some of the stupidity that went on in college, but also you probably thought it was pretty cool to kind of create your own path. What was it like for you?
Well, college was great because you can pick what your special interest is to study.
I know.
So for me, a young philosopher and a writer, what did I do? I got a double bachelor's degree in English and philosophy. So with that, I was able to sit in my container, in my space, in my room with the colors and the sounds and the smells, and just sit and write for hours and hours. That worked really well for me. So I didn't have a whole lot of huge lectures that I had to go to. And I also got put in the honors program, which meant that for the majority of my college experience, I'm in classrooms with only 10 kids. So there's not the 400 kid lecture halls. which I'm so grateful for, because I don't know how college would have been if I just would have been in regular classes with everyone else. That would have been pretty overwhelming.
And you're with probably pretty serious students.
Yeah.
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 So that really, so nowhere in there. So like, was Scott the first person to say to you, "Hey, I think you might be autistic"?
Yes.
Really? So interesting. And, let's talk about I want to talk about the brain differences
Mhm.
of male to females and autism. So, males tend to get identified and have more severity of symptoms
Mhm.
because, for whatever reason, they tend to have more coordination issues.
Mhm.
And the more coordination issues you have, the greater your symptoms are. That's what we know in research. Where girls don't have as many coordination issues and don't seem to be as impacted in the same way. Not to say that we don't have severity in there, but in the brains of
Mhm.
autistics, girls have less impairments comparatively, statistically, and they tend to get identified not until much later,
Mhm.
right? And that you work with companies, you talk to people, you educate people about neurodivergence. Has that been your experience, just in talking with other women, which is such a focus for you, that it's just much more common to get identified later?
Absolutely, because I would say males have more observable traits, right? That's what it is. So a boy, we see the typical hand flapping, right? He might get overwhelmed. We might see a boy hand flapping. I also stim, but I hide mine. Mine is not so observable. I'm clicking my teeth. I'm counting. So the way that I'm stimming is I'm sitting here and I count everything, and I'm counting ceiling and tiles and this and cars, and my brain is constantly working like that. Or I'm like clicking my fingers down here, or I'm popping my fingers, but it's less observable.
Mhm.
And one of the issues that we also have is, historically speaking, which subject group are we studying for any kind of mental health, for any kind of conditions? We're studying males. Typically, a group of young
Yes.
white males, that's our subject group. So what we know about autism and a lot of these neurodivergences is based on what has been studied in that one subject group. So females have been left out of the equation in a lot of ways. And then you also have the fact that, societally speaking, boys are given a lot more freedom just to kind of do whatever they want. Where I'm a girl, I'm from the South, and you are taught to don't be too much. Make eye contact, have a firm handshake, don't be too loud, but don't be too weird. Don't be too this or too that, or too anything. And we're taught to just kind of like stay in our lane and smile and nod. And boys are not conditioned in the same way that we are.
No, they're not. Not at all. We're taught to accommodate and be caregivers,
Absolutely.
right? And we're
Absolutely.
also boys are taught, it's okay to kind of break the mold and sort of do other things, right? But we are, not women are enculturated to be
Mhm.
quiet and follow along and be little helpers in the classroom and all those other things, right? I love that you talk about that the stimming was happening for you, but in a way that was less observable because
Mhm.
so many of the times when I work with people, it is much later for young women. And then there's sort of this disbelief, like what you experienced within the family. Like, how could this be autism?
Mhm.
Because I know an autistic and he's nonverbal and he's doing this and he's doing that. And the spectrum is quite wide. And
Mhm.
we are really starting to understand. And it's scary to think you might have autism or ADHD even, but so many people get diagnosed with ADHD long before they get diagnosed with autism. Was that the case for you as well?
I got diagnosed at the same time, and I will
You
say that
did.
the ADHD diagnosis was more shocking for me than the autism one. Because what do we know about ADHD, right? It's the little boy who's bouncing off the walls and he can't stay quiet, and he's talking incessantly. That's not me. But when you have the comorbid autism and ADHD, the autistic part of me is very structured and organized, and I achieve these goals that I set for myself, and no one is pushing me to do that. The ADHD side of me is the one that has all of these ideas, though,
Mhm.
right? So it makes a really interesting balance, where I know my experience might be different if I had only one, but I do
It
know
is
that it's different.
incredibly common, Zara. And in fact, I've been writing and doing videos a lot about AUDHD, which is that combination, right,
Mhm.
of the two that you're experiencing, that it's that common that we have like Benifer, we have AUDHD,
The
right?
AuDHers.
Yes,
Yeah,
there's 2 ways to say it, tomato,
yeah.
tomato. So, and it is, it is a very common combination because at a minimum, your executive functioning is impaired with autism because you're gonna have a restricted interest. I mean, that's
Mhm.
just part of autism, right? And we talked beforehand, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the difference that often girls have in their restricted interests in comparison to boys. And I think that's a big reason why girls aren't identified. Can you talk a little bit about how boys and girls, females and males display their restricted interests differently?
Yeah, well, when we look at children, what the stereotype for autistic child is trains and automobiles and
Elevators too. I got a lot of
eleva
elevators.
elevators and dinosaurs, right? It's
Yes.
but typically it's object based. So it's like a car. It's a, it's this object and they become hyper fixated on that. That's their special interest. And we interviewed people for our autism documentary, and this kid knows every train in New York City, and he took us on the trains. That's his thing. Autistic girls often have human based, like a celebrity or something, or animal based. So I have something that I call I have a lot of theories, okay? And I have something that I call the horse girl theory, where you have a lot of autistic girls and their special interest is horses or sometimes cats. And when I was teaching, I would see the girls that would act like cats and they would wear cat ears, or they're super interested in horses and they just want to ride horses. And and I think what that has to do with is that it's easier for us to understand. So this animal, this horse, this cat, they have less expectations of me as a friend. They're going to love me unconditionally. I don't have to talk nonstop with them. I can just kind of be in their presence and they're comforting. So we see a lot of that in autistic girls where it's just the interest is very different than a boy.
And I love that perspective. I actually, Zara, have never heard somebody give that perspective that, we choose these sort of real people or real objects.
Mhm.
I mean, not objects, but mammals that help us to feel good about ourselves, right? Like it's that unconditional love. And it's much more socially acceptable than
Yeah,
a train or some other thing, right?
absolutely.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. And, when you also talk a lot about, because I follow you on social, you talk about ARFID and restricted
Mhm.
eating. And I want to talk about this because, restrictive eating is not a joke. And it is a very serious thing. It's painful for the person. It's very hard on parents. It's misunderstood. And it means that a lot of times you're not getting proper nutrients,
Mhm.
and that has its own effect. Talk a little bit about that experience for you and, your journey, what you feel like has been helpful or not helpful too.
Mhm. I have struggled with eating my entire life, and a lot of it had to do with the textures of the foods or the smells, where a certain texture, a certain smell, something like that, it makes me, it like hits my gag reflex and I can't do it. So I grew up being told that I'm just picky. You're just a picky eater. Why don't you just eat more? Kids would make fun of me in middle school and say that I had an eating disorder. But when I found something that I liked, I would eat it, eat it, eat it, eat it. And then it was like, oh, well, she must be bulimic. She must be throwing up because she's so thin. Um, but essentially, it's just that we're so hypersensitive to the food that we eat that we just can't. And so, a lot of the autistic people, they just eat like the chicken nugget diet or the
Right.
buttered noodles. So for me, I stopped eating meat when I was 10 years old because I couldn't do it. I couldn't stomach it. And it wasn't until this last year, even after being a professor of neurodivergent women and making films on this, that one of my students, I had them do research papers, and one of them did a research paper on ARFID, and I said, "What is this?" I hadn't heard it before. Avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And I said, "That's me. That's me." I discovered in adulthood, after being a professor of this, that I had this eating disorder. And for me, once I realized I wasn't a picky eater, that I had an actual eating disorder, something shifted in my brain. And I said, okay, I'm going to change this. I'm not just picky. This isn't something that I'm cursed with my entire life. 27 years later, I started to try to eat meat again. And I started introducing different foods that I wouldn't try. A pickle, never tried a pickle. I knew I wouldn't like it. I tried one anyway. I didn't like it, but I tried it anyway. I started trying to eat different kinds of meat. Just for me, it was about dismantling the fear around food and the fear around it, to where if I saw meat on a plate or on a table, I wouldn't touch it. Now
And
it's
Zara, were you afraid of the way it was gonna feel? Was that your fear for you now as an adult? Do you recognize, I mean, I know it's a lot of it's sensory,
Mhm.
absolutely. But what's the fear is what's gonna happen, the outcome when you have that?
Um, so I'm a very visual person. Part of my autism is that I have these movies and things that play in my head. So when it comes to meat, it's like I could see the animal. I could see this dead, and then I would see it inside of me, and I couldn't handle it. So I think that I did create a lot of fear around that, just based on that and the visual aspect of it. But for me, I've been able to dismantle the fear to where I don't really eat meat anymore, but I'm not afraid of it anymore.
What would be really helpful for parents to know about restrictive eating to help their kids?
I think that one of the most helpful things you can do for your kid is do not shame them. Don't call them, "Oh, you're just a difficult picky eater," because that creates more anxiety around eating. And now they're going to be anxious eating in front of people. I used to do weird things with my food and, like, degrease my pizza, and people were always staring at me and watching me eat, and it made me really uncomfortable. So I would say don't shame them, don't make them feel uncomfortable or weird.
How do you feel about presenting different food options for kids? That's one of the recommendations that I have. And, parents do give up. They try to get their kids to eat something and they back away from it. Oh, they won't do it. They say that it takes at least 14 times to introduce a food. I actually think it's as high as 30 times
Mhm.
um, to help them to eat it without shaming them or making a big deal out of it. But how do you feel about giving kids a choice and giving them a couple options? Would that have been helpful for you?
I think you could give me options, but at the same time, I would not have been eating. I still wouldn't do it. To this day, there's textures like melted cheese that I can't do. So it's about recognizing that you're not going to be able to force your ARFID child into eating
No.
anything that they don't want to eat. It's just
Are
not.
you using sensory techniques today to help you to eat food?
Absolutely. So for me, small pieces is important. So for instance, when I tried eating meat again, so like a thick steak, that wouldn't work for me, but like something thin and crispy. I mean, I'm from the South, so fried chicken and gravy, I can I can handle that. I can eat that. Because it's a texture thing and you have the crispy around it. But big chunks of anything, I'm not going to eat. So I
Yeah.
think maybe cutting things up in small pieces for your kids is helpful.
Yeah. And I think helping, each kid is going to be a little different. Some kids going to like something soft, another kid's going to like
Mhm.
texture. I have found that a lot of my kids that have ARFID really respond well to strong tasting food. So
Mhm.
spicing things, right? Not spicy, but it could be spicy, but putting a lot of seasoning on things instead of making things more neutral. Yet other kids like neutral. So playing around within what your kids' interests are can be helpful. And I've also found incredibly helpful. I'm a big proponent of getting kids to make their own food with you.
Mhm.
And I have found kids to be more exploratory and be surprised by,
Absolutely.
yeah,
And and
right?
and at the end of the day too, what's our goal? Our goal is that our child is eating.
That's
And
right.
if your kid only wants to eat Annie's white mac and cheese like mine, then and they're eating, okay, dice up some broccoli real small, throw it in there, and at least they're eating something.
Getting some
You
in
know?
there.
It's
And also some of my restrictive eaters, most of mine are very open to smoothies. And so I can do a lot with smoothies. If they like soups or stews, oh, I can get a lot in there. So
Yeah, and
think
juice.
about
So
where you can put nutrients.
I make what we call unicorn juice, which is essentially I juice and I have all these different colored vegetables and fruits. And if you call it unicorn juice and call it rainbow juice, it's less scary.
It
So
is
it's like
less scary.
how do we make food less scary? Give it a cute name.
Yeah.
Cut your sandwiches in little heart shapes. I like to do that for them. make it more sensory friendly and aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah, and sensory difficulties are so real. And I know they're obstacles and you have to be proactive instead of reactive to them, but when you make that investment into the proactive components of sensory, it's a win for both of
Mhm.
you. And food, getting people to think about that and why their kid may be restrictive, and know that not all restricted eaters have autism or ADHD, and some people have sensory issues on their own,
Mhm.
but sensory issues do occur at a much higher rate in the neurodivergent population,
Yeah.
for
And
sure.
and I will say, if you have a daughter, if you have a teenage daughter and she has an eating disorder, ask why. Because
Mhm.
oftentimes people think that it has to do with trying to maintain a certain weight. For me, it wasn't about that. So it's like, ask why and try to get to the bottom of why they're doing the things that they're doing and eating
Yeah.
the way that they are.
And restrictive eating related to sensory processing is very common, as well as OCD. So I have a lot of people who have obsessive compulsive thoughts about food, whether there's germs in it or where it came from or all these other things,
Mhm.
which can or cannot be with autism, even though that occurs at a high level. But there's many reasons why clinical behaviors happen, and you got to get to the root causes.
Yeah.
And I love,
Yes.
having conversations is how we figure this out. We don't just make assumptions.
Yes, and the OCD, I'm so glad you brought that up. That was probably the main symptom that I had growing up that I look back on now. Because what we see with that is that I don't have control over my brain and the thoughts that are constantly spinning and the movies that are playing. I don't have control over how sensitive I am to food and people and smells. So it's a matter of trying. OCD for me and a lot of autistic people is trying to find control in our lives where we can. And it's exhausting. And for me as a child, nobody understood that. I didn't learn what OCD was until I'm in a psych class in college. And I said, that's me. So for me, it's the constant counting. It's counting steps. It's counting. It's having to do things in a certain way. To get out of a swimming pool, I had to do a front flip, a back flip, front flip. I had to knock my knees together 3 times. And I created all of these rituals as a way to find some kind of control in my life because it was
Mhm.
lacking elsewhere.
Yeah. And it provided in the when you do the rituals, I think this is what's hard for parents to understand, or individuals in general, the OCD brain, when you do that ritual, you actually get a little relief. So
Mhm.
the brain is much more likely to repeat it. And that's why those behaviors can really be sticky, right? So
Mhm.
you have to behaviorally unwind that, which is hard,
Yeah.
because the brain is like, well, I got some relief. What else
Yeah.
are you gonna do to give me relief? But
Yeah.
you can learn to talk back to
And
it.
the parents don't really understand it. I always had a thing with numbers and with prime numbers. And if I'm listening to a radio, it needs to be on, 13, 15, or 17, right? My mom didn't necessarily understand that. And it would make me feel crazy if she would put it on 12. 12 is not a good number. You can't have the radio on 12, right? So I think, again, for parents, is just giving your kids some space.
So, when in looking at all these things that have sort of happened to you, and being able to put the pieces together, and that diagnosis, which everyone's so scared of, like when I talk to parents, I go, "Can we talk about the A word?" And they're like, "What are we talking about?" And I'm like, "Autism." And they're like,
Mhm.
do you think it's autism?" And I'm like, "Look, yeah, I do. And let's talk about why, and let's not be so scared of it. And let's help you to get an understanding of it, right?" It seems like it's
Mhm.
the worst thing in the world, right? And with neurodivergence just on the rise, and 1 in 27 boys have autism, right? 1 in 44 births are autistic, I think, right now. And
Mhm.
then we're moving to, they believe that by 2031, it's going to be 1 in 27 of all births.
Mhm.
So it's going to be a neurodivergent society.
It is a neurodivergent society, and it's not. Everyone says, well, why are there so many more autistic people now? There's not. We're just getting diagnosed finally.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is definitely, I would say there's a dramatic increase in mental health issues because people
Absolutely.
aren't attending to their mental garden, right?
Mhm.
How do you use the word give space, right? So I was listening to, and I thought, oh gosh, Zara, when you were a kid and a teenager, right, you must have been exhausted. No wonder why you were angry. all this stuff just coming through and not being able to filter it. That's how I explain people when I do the QEGs, that
Mhm.
there's too much coming in. There's nothing blocking it, right?
Mhm.
And how do you today help yourself and your child? How do you help to regulate your own nervous system?
I create a safe space wherever I'm at. I have this big Indian looking tent with all these pillows in it, and you can close it up if you want. So for me, having small contained spaces and for my child is really helpful. So they can go in their little zone. I liked to climb in closets as a child because again, it's that small contained space, which I think is really helpful. Um,
And I love that you have a portable tent. Like hug swings are a great thing. Sometimes, if you're traveling or whatever, you can roll your kid in a yoga mat. There's lots of
yeah,
ways to create that kind of well, that's proprioceptive feedback
yeah.
but there's lots of ways to create safety and each one is
Mhm.
unique. But I do find that autistics do love small spaces,
Mhm. It's
right?
very comforting, and my son also, he likes to wear my fur coats. That's comforting for him, and it has my smell on it, and they're soft, and so he'll walk around wearing my fur coats 'cause it's
And it's
again, it's
probably
that
heavy
contained.
too.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of weighted blankets. Weighted blankets
Mhm.
will calm the nervous system really quite beautifully for at least 15 to 20 minutes. And it can help people. Everyone's different, right? And how they respond to a
Mhm.
weighted blanket. I don't know if that's in your jam. Now, I'm going to say this again, you're a filmmaker,
Mhm.
professor, a speaker, and talk about, I feel fortunate. I am in a film that you're doing about ADHD. You just did one on autism. Talk about your journey into filmmaking and how you make it work at work. Like, how do you manage everything, your assets, the Achilles heels that come along with it? How are you making it work, and why are you so successful?
I feel like for me, having a creative career and being able to be a filmmaker, that's the only way that I could have a career, really. I know that for myself, I will never be able to sit in a cubicle and work a 9 to 5. I know that I'm not capable of that. I got hired for one of those jobs one day, I walked out, I cried, and I never showed up to work. So I feel very fortunate to be in a creative space where I can work from home a lot of times. Um, and work from my little areas. I'm very organized, and so I think that helps with the filmmaking. So me and Scott, we made these two films together. He's got these big ideas, and I am the one that's able to sit there and execute them, the
And
details.
he's always trying to take you off track, Zara, with his big ideas.
Yeah, so it's like keep helping to stay focused. But I think that again, having partners and having people that we work with that balance us out, I think is really important because we can't do everything by ourselves. So knowing what you're capable of, what your strengths are, and what your team's strengths are, and allowing everyone to do their job without trying to micromanage and control, I think that's really important and really helpful.
When I have the privilege of working with, kids, right, before they launch into the world or pick a college, track or whatever, I always say to the parents of neurodivergence, it's always important to do what you're passionate about. But
Mhm.
when you're neurodivergent, it's a non-negotiable, and really foster their aptitudes and really their interests. And hopefully that will lead to a lifelong career like you loved writing, like you talked
Mhm.
about, and all those components. And you're able to be successful. And, thinking that, oh, yeah, they would be better at accounting. No, that's not the way that's going to be their
Mhm.
path to success, right?
No,
And I think a
yeah.
lot of parents push their kids because they think that's right. You have to match up what those interests are for career.
Yeah, one of when I interviewed Temple Grandin last year, one of the things that she emphasized was she said you have to lean into their special interests, whatever it is, lean into it because that's what they're going to be good at. That's what they're going to be passionate at, and they'll be able to have a career around that, right? For
Yeah,
me, I was a young
absolutely.
writer. I was a poet, and my parents never told me that that wasn't a viable job. Never once did they tell me that that I had crazy dreams and I couldn't fulfill them. And that support, like, look at me now, I'm in my 30s, and I'm able to forge a career out of those interests.
Yeah. And, you're making these impactful films. Can
Mhm.
you talk a little bit about these two films, one on
Mhm.
autism, one on ADHD? And, I know they're going to have a huge impact on in the world, but talk
Mhm.
about them.
So we made a film called Understanding Autism, and we simultaneously made a film called ADHD Wired Differently, because that we're so ADHD, we couldn't just make one documentary at a time, right? We had to make two at a time. So with this, we went around the world and we were able to interview all of the top experts and neuroscientists and doctors and people like you who are on the top of their game, and really kind of craft a different view on these neurodivergences that the world hasn't seen yet. And I feel like with where we are in society and with where we are at understanding these different neurodivergences, just seeing that different perspective was so important. And then bringing in families. We interviewed actual patients and families and kids to see their experience. Because one of the issues that I have is what we know about autism is based on a doctor observing the traits in us. We don't hear from the autistic people themselves. So that's what really differentiated our films from what's been created before, is we're just showing the world the inside the homes, inside the families. Here's the struggles, here's the beauty, and at the heart of it all is that you have family that love each other deeply, and you have mothers that are doing whatever it takes to make the changes necessary in world and in the legislature, to create a more hospitable environment for their neurodivergent kids.
Oh, I'm so looking forward to these because of the impact they're going to have, and I feel really grateful to be part of it, particularly in your ADHD Wired Differently. You really emphasize natural solutions
Mhm.
for healing the brain and body, and really talk really quite frankly about the dangers of psychiatric medications. And so I know that's going to have a big impact in the world. Um, in helping parents to have hope and know how to best really parent, because none of us are, taught to parent, and we're certainly not taught to parent a neurodivergent, and we're sort of
Mhm.
we're building the car as we go, right?
Yeah.
With a lot of love. And I think a lot of parents feel terrible about themselves, right?
Mhm.
I had a parent the other day and they have a neurodivergent, and I was like, "You are doing the most amazing job." And they started crying. And I love when I get parents to cry with relief.
Mm.
And I don't want parents to feel that. What would be, like a final tip for parents in supporting their neurodivergent child that you feel like parents need to know?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would say the most important thing is to trust your child, trust them and listen to them. And if they are sensitive about something, if they're having a big emotion, allow them to have it. And again, hold space for them, be there for them. The whole goal here is not to make your neurodivergent child neurotypical. And I think that's what ABA therapy is doing. That's what stimulant drugs are doing. We're trying to make the world around our child more comfortable instead of making our child more comfortable. So I would say, as a parent, find a way to make your child comfortable. What do they need in that moment? And if they don't know, then you just hold them and you allow them to feel and experience what they're experiencing in the world at that moment, and create a safe space for them to do so without judgment.
That is just so beautiful. I can't even begin to tell you that I wish that for every child and family, and also for parents to feel that empowered to do that, because they're
Mhm.
made to feel bad. They're made that, by people around them inadvertently making them feel like their kid is less than if they're not in that box.
Yeah.
And
Or
you're like,
the kid has a meltdown in public, has a big
yeah,
feeling in public, and the parent isn't concerned about the child. They're concerned about, what does everyone think?
right. Right. And that's what, having these conversations about
Mhm.
neurodiversity helps us to widen our understanding. And neurodivergence is the norm.
It really
And,
is.
and so having more love and acceptance and listening to your child is really important. And I
Yeah.
want parents to know that it's really okay to do that. We're
Yeah.
always in this race to fix our kids. And maybe it's our kids that doesn't need fixing. It's the society,
Absolutely.
right? And
And
acceptance of it.
And let's look at all of the great innovations that have been created in the world. Look at Tesla and SpaceX, and look at Microsoft, and look at all of these things that were created from neurodivergent people. So it's like when we allow our child to just be themselves and to lean into their natural interests, look at what they're able to create and the impact that they can make in the world.
Yeah. And enjoy and accept the journey along the way.
Mhm.
It may be imperfect, and that's okay.
Mhm.
You know? Well, thank you for inspiring so many with your work and having this conversation because it's, as we're both
Mhm.
parents of neurodivergence and to have kids struggle, there's a lot of fear with it. And these kind of conversations can hopefully make parents feel good about how they are loving and supporting their child.
Absolutely. And I think podcasts like this and the films that we're making are going to change the way that we as a society view autism and view ADHD. And breaking down that stigma is the first step in creating a more neuro-inclusive world.
Well,
So
keep
thank
up the
you.
good work, my friend. Thank you so much.